There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Are those several books in your pocket, or are you just happy to see me? This is a response video to a discussion video that Lukash over at Totally Pretentious put up on his channel a few days ago, entitled Bookish Polygamy, in which he talks about his experience of mostly being a one book at a time reader, but more recent experience and his levels of satisfaction and or dissatisfaction with reading more than one book at a time. Bookish polygamy. So here's my answer video, and I'm entitling it Confessions of a Book Slut, and want to talk about the same issue in my life. I will put a link to Lukash's video below, and he raises a lot of important issues, only some of which I'm going to respond to here, so please check out his video. For example, he talks about reading books of different genres and audiobooks versus print books as different strategies for reading polyamorously. And I'm not going to focus too much, if at all, on those topics. I just want to talk to you about what works deeply and what sometimes doesn't work so well about being a book slut, okay? So, I was monogamous in my reading until just a few years ago. Always one book at a time. And then I went through a reading slump that lasted several years. And I came out on the other side of that about 4 or 5 years ago and have never looked back. And since then, I have been reading fiendishly and got involved on social media with bookish people, Litzy especially, and then bookish podcasts, and more recently, BookTube. In and amongst those experiences, I became a proud book sleaze. One of the things that Lukash talked about in his video was that he finds it difficult to focus his attention on more than one book in progress at a time, and that inevitably putting one book down and picking another one up involves pushing the book you just put down off the table and putting the new book on the table, and that is something he doesn't like about reading more than one book at a time. It's really impossible to focus on more than one book. My spin on it is a little different. I talked about some of these issues in a tag about 6 months ago, some kind of Confessions of a Bookaholic tag. I don't know what it was, so I wanted to make a special video here that would be devoted to the topic, and I will be reiterating some of what I said. One of the things that I said on that video some months ago was that people don't have trouble, usually, following the story on more than one TV program, so what's the difference with books? That's one thing. And I don't have trouble following the stories in a bunch of books that I'm reading concurrently, usually. If I'm reading, and I only read fiction, 99.99%, so if I'm reading a work of fiction that's set in a culture that's unfamiliar to me, for example, perhaps African American culture or Indigenous Canadian culture or Indian culture, I don't like to read two of those books from the same culture that's not familiar to me at the same time, because it's a new culture to me and I just think I would get certain things possibly mixed up. But if I'm reading books set in the West, I can read, right now I think I'm reading maybe 9 books, actively reading 8 or 9 books at one time, and I can read up to maybe 10 or a dozen books at the same time, and I'm fine. A little bit more on that later. But I can keep the stories straight, keep them separate. And this leads me to the main point that I want to make on this video, which is, yes, it is a challenge. If I have 10 books on my roster and I'm reading them all, often that means I will dip into 5 on Monday and the other 5 on Tuesday, and so on and so on. Or it may be less often than that, and I will talk about frequency a little later in this video as well. But because it is a little bit of a challenge to pick up the threads of a story after 2 days or after a week, re-immersing myself in it and flipping back to remember, who is this John guy again? Or if it's an ebook, it's so easy to go back to the very first reference. Ebooks are wonderful for that. Audiobooks are terrible. Print books, it's a little bit more of an onerous process, but not impossible. But reacquainting myself with the narrative after having put it down for a day, 3 days, a week, that process imprints the narrative, imprints the work of fiction more deeply in me. So my recall of books that I have read in the last 4 years is much deeper than it is, for example, of any of the books that I read in a serially monogamous way 5 years ago. There are two other things about my reading life that are integrally related to being a literary sleaze bucket, reading several books at one time. One is bailing. I bail a lot, I bail often, I bail early. But I'm not going to talk any more than that, but that's part of this whole schema. And the other is I am a slow reader. Not that I read slowly, but when I'm reading a book that I'm enjoying, I want to slow right down. And polygamous reading makes that possible. It draws the book out. I'll give you some examples of all of these in a minute. But the main joy of polyamorous reading is that the books that I read stick with me longer. So that is fabulous. The thing that complicates it is when I have a whole bunch of buddy reads, which is usually all the time. So that can complicate things. If I'm buddy reading a book too quickly, the chances are that I'm not going to remember it. And the example that I can think of in recent reading is the 1984 Booker Prize winning novel Hotel du Lac by Anita Brookner, which I buddy read very early in 2019 with Amy of From the Dusty Bookshelf. Didn't love the book, was quite captivated by certain aspects of the book, really enjoyed the buddy read, but we read it over about a 3-day period, which I agreed to, which I probably suggested because it was a short book, but I don't remember very much of it at all. I can remember some of the things I liked and some of the things that I didn't like, but in a really fuzzy way, and I can remember very little of the story. If I had read that book over 2 weeks, I would remember more of it. I guarantee it. Just based on how well I remember books that I read that same month in a much more long, drawn-out, and polyamorous way. Okay? Another downside is when I get too slutty and I have too many books, and I'm not sure what the number is. It might be max of 10 books at one time that I'm actively reading, or maybe a dozen. If I have any more than that, then things start to fall off the edges. And sometimes it's because of buddy reads. I have too many buddy reads, so a novel that I am reading just for myself gets pushed to the back of the shelf, and I can't get to it for a month. I can put a book aside for a week. I can put a book aside for 2 weeks, but any longer than that, and then it's really hard to pick the threads back up. That was a problem with this book, which I started during the Asian Readathon, which was in April maybe. I was enjoying it, I was really into it, and then I had to put it aside for a month or more. When I came back to it, I really probably should have started it again because I couldn't pick the threads back up. So my enjoyment of the book suffered because of that. And then to give a positive and a negative example, because sometimes, it hasn't happened very often, but some books, in my experience, very few, but some books don't lend themselves to polyamorous reading. So, for example, this is one of my most favorite novels of all time, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena by Anthony Marra, and I slow read this over maybe a 2 or 3 month period several years ago, and I can step back into that story in my mind like it was yesterday. I want to reread it, but not to refresh my memory because my memory is still so fresh. This is just an incredibly searing novel, and it has seared itself onto my reading brain. A year or so later, I tried Mara's second book, which is a collection of interlinked short stories, The Tsar of Love and Techno. And this cycle of short stories, the links are so subtle that it didn't work when I was reading a bunch of stuff alongside it. I missed things. I didn't read it over too long of a period, maybe a month. I don't remember how long, but it wasn't that I put it down for too long, but it was that putting it down, maybe especially in between the stories that weren't so obviously linked, and you had to really have all the stories stewing away. I didn't get along with this book as well, and I think it was because I was reading it slutishly. So I want to reread it monogamously someday. But literally, this is the only one I can think of in the last 4 years where that was a problem. Other examples, this is my favorite novel of all time, Madeleine Tien's Do Not Say We Have Nothing, and I read this over a 3 or a 4 month period alongside umpteen other books, and again, it was just a marvelous experience, and I can jump back into the reading experience that I had like nobody's business because it was such a deep and rich experience. Slow reading made this so incredibly memorable. And I have declared that my new favorite writer is Cora Sandell, the Norwegian writer who wrote in the first half of the 20th century. And I read the first in her Alberta trilogy, Alberta and Jacob. Last year I started it in Women in Translation Month. And it took me 2 months, maybe, or more to finish it. Absolutely loved it. It's still living inside me. And then this year I read the second volume, Alberta and Freedom, over about the same time period, and yeah, just phenomenal. So those are some examples of that. Mostly polygamous reading suits me just fine because it allows me to read books more slowly and absorb them more deeply. Maybe my last comment here will be that I also love the synchronicities that can emerge between books I'm reading at the same time. I did a video in the summer, I believe, about happening upon scenes of characters in 3 works of fiction that I was reading at the same time where a character saw snow for the first time. And it was just like, what? In fact, I never did follow up, but I found another scene the week after in a 4th work of fiction. And those kind of things are just fantastic. I love the way that books talk to each other through my readerly sleazy shenanigans. Alright, that's what I have to contribute to this conversation. Lukáš did not make this a tag, but I think maybe he should have. I'm not going to call on anybody individually to make your own videos. I'd love to have your comments below, but if you have a channel and you have some things to say, why don't you just do your own response video? Because I think this is a fascinating topic. And again, please go check out not only Lukáš's video, which is great, but also the many really thoughtful comments that he got from his subscribers. And now, I think I'm going to slip into something more comfortable and go slut about my bookshelves. Thanks for watching.